In January 1984, Commodore seemed to be standing near the height of its power in home computing. The Commodore 64 had become one of the most recognizable machines of the era, selling into homes, schools, and small businesses at a price that placed serious computing within reach of millions of people. Behind that success stood Jack Tramiel, the hard-driving executive whose obsession with low prices and mass production had helped transform Commodore from an office machine company into a major force in personal computers. Then, with little public warning, he was gone. Tramiel resigned from Commodore on January 13th, leaving the company he had spent decades building just as its computer business had reached extraordinary scale. The departure immediately created a puzzle. Contemporary statements emphasized an amicable transition and suggested that Commodore needed a different management structure as it grew larger. Later recollections pointed to deeper disagreements between Tramiel and Chairman Irving Gould over control, strategy, and the company's future. The exact private sequence remains disputed, and reducing it to one explosive argument would make the history cleaner than the evidence allows. What can be established is that a relationship central to Commodore's rise had broken apart. The man whose management philosophy had shaped the company was suddenly outside it, while the computer industry he understood better than almost anyone was still changing at enormous speed. To understand why his exit mattered so much, it is necessary to look at the kind of company Tramiel had created. Commodore had not begun as a computer manufacturer. Tramiel entered business through typewriter repair and office equipment after surviving the Second World War and emigrating to North America. Over time, Commodore moved through typewriters, adding machines and electronic calculators, each transition exposing the company to a recurring danger. A product that looked profitable could become vulnerable when competitors found a cheaper way to manufacture it. Semiconductor technology made that lesson especially severe during the calculator wars of the 1970s. Suppliers could become competitors. Component costs could determine whether a product survived, and a company without control over critical technology could discover that its margins had disappeared almost overnight. Commodore's response was not merely to design another calculator. It moved deeper into electronics, acquiring semiconductor capability through MOS technology and bringing important chip expertise closer to the company. That decision helped create the foundation for Commodore's entry into personal computers. The PET, introduced in the late 1970s, gave the company a complete computer system with an integrated display, keyboard, storage, and software environment. It was followed by the VIC-20, which pushed the price of personal computing lower and reached a much broader consumer audience. Tramiel's philosophy became increasingly clear through these products. Computers should not remain expensive tools, reserved for specialists, wealthy enthusiasts, or corporate departments. If manufacturing costs could be driven down and volume pushed upward, they could be sold as mass-market products. The Commodore 64 became the most successful expression of that strategy. Introduced in 1982, it combined strong graphics and sound capabilities with a price Commodore could reduce aggressively because the company controlled important parts of its semiconductor supply chain. This vertical integration gave Tramiel a weapon competitors found difficult to match. Commodore could squeeze margins, lower retail prices, and still benefit from owning much of the technology inside the machine. The result was a brutal period of price competition in the home computer market. Companies that had expected stable margins suddenly faced products selling for much less. Dealers struggled as price cuts changed the value of inventory already sitting on shelves. Competitors were forced to respond even when doing so damaged their own economics. Tramiel's methods could expand the market while making that same market extremely unforgiving. His approach generated admiration from people who saw affordable computers spreading rapidly, but it also created tension inside and outside Commodore. He was known for demanding results, controlling costs relentlessly, and treating price as a strategic weapon rather than merely a number attached after engineering was complete. That mentality had been effective while Commodore was fighting to establish itself. By 1983, however, the company had become something much larger than the entrepreneurial organization Tramiel had once managed through direct pressure and personal authority. Revenue had climbed dramatically. The Commodore 64 was selling in enormous quantities. International operations, manufacturing, marketing, product planning, finance, and distribution were becoming more complex. Success created organizational questions that could not be solved by cutting the price of another computer. Who would control investment? How much authority should remain concentrated around Tramiel? How aggressively should Commodore continue expanding? What kind of management structure did a company of this scale now require? Irving Gould, Commodore's chairman and a crucial financial figure in the company's history, did not always share Tramiel's view of how the organization should be run. Later accounts describe growing tension between the two men, but the historical record does not justify turning their disagreement into a simple personal feud with one universally accepted cause. What matters for the documentary is the consequence. In early 1984, The partnership that had helped sustain Commodore through years of financial pressure and industrial change could no longer continue in the same form. Tramiel resigned. His departure was striking because the company was not collapsing when he left. Commodore was selling one of the defining home computers of the era. The brand had international reach, substantial manufacturing capability, and a huge installed base. Leaving under those conditions was fundamentally different from walking away from a failed venture. Tramiel was separating himself from a successful machine business whose competitive instincts bore his imprint. That made his next move unusually important. He did not leave the computer industry as someone whose ideas had been disproven. The opposite was closer to the truth. His belief that advanced technology could be pushed toward mass market pricing had been validated by the VIC-20 and Commodore 64. He understood component costs, manufacturing leverage, distribution pressure, and the danger of allowing a competitor to define the price structure of an entire market. He also knew engineers capable of designing computers under severe cost and schedule constraints. What he no longer possessed was the company through which he had exercised those advantages. For a brief moment after his resignation, the future was open. Commodore had to prove that its success could continue without the executive who had shaped so much of its culture. Tramiel had to decide whether he wanted to build another technology business or leave the industry he had helped reshape. Personal computing itself was moving rapidly beyond the 8-bit era. Apple had introduced the Macintosh in January 1984 with a mouse-driven graphical interface. Motorola's 68,000 processor was giving designers access to a more capable generation of machines. Graphical software, larger memory, better storage, and richer applications were beginning to change expectations about what a personal computer could be. Repeating the Commodore 64 formula would not be enough to define the next decade. Any new entrant would need modern technology, a strong engineering team, and a price aggressive enough to attract buyers already facing an expanding field of incompatible platforms. At almost the same time, another famous name in consumer electronics was confronting a very different crisis. Atari had once dominated the home video game business under Warner Communications, but the market collapse of the early 1980s had turned that celebrated brand into a financial burden. Losses mounted, confidence weakened, and Warner began looking for a way to separate itself from the consumer operation. Tramiel had just lost control of a successful computer empire. Atari's owner was trying to escape a damaged one. The circumstances were moving toward each other. Atari's crisis offered exactly the kind of opportunity that could attract someone who understood both the danger and the value hidden inside a distressed computer company. Only a few years earlier, Atari had been one of the most recognizable names in electronic entertainment. Its home consoles helped define the first great wave of video games, and Warner Communications had treated the business as an important growth engine. That position deteriorated rapidly as the American video game market became saturated. Disappointing software-crowded store shelves, retailers became cautious, and Atari's costs turned falling demand into enormous losses. By 1984, separating the troubled consumer operation had become more attractive to Warner than continuing to absorb those losses. The condition of Atari made the company risky, but it also meant that assets almost impossible to acquire during its strongest years were suddenly available. Tramiel did not wait for a purchase before deciding what kind of computer business he wanted to build next. During the spring of 1984, he formed Tramel Technology Limited, using a spelling intended to encourage the pronunciation of his family name. The organization began without the factories, distribution network, brand recognition, or semiconductor infrastructure he had commanded at Commodore. What it did have was a clear commercial objective and access to engineers who understood how to turn that objective into hardware. Former Commodore employees joined the venture, including Shiraz Shivji, who had played an important role in Commodore's computer development and would become central to the machine eventually known as the Atari ST. By late April and May, before any Atari acquisition had been completed, the small team was already defining a system for the next generation of personal computing. It would move beyond the limits of 8-bit home machines, use bitmapped graphics and a windowed interface, and provide enough capability to compete with newer graphical computers without carrying their premium prices. MIDI support was considered early, long before anyone could know how important that decision would later become to Atari's position in music. The most important constraint remained economic. Advanced technology would matter only if the finished machine could be sold at a price ordinary buyers could approach. That requirement shaped engineering from the beginning. Several processors were considered, but the Motorola 68,000 emerged as the practical choice because it offered the necessary capability without pushing the project beyond Atari's cost and schedule limits. The team was not designing a machine in isolation. Every technical decision had to survive the question of whether it could be manufactured quickly and sold aggressively enough to create a market. At this stage, Atari itself was still only a possibility. Tramel Technology needed far more than a prototype. A computer company required manufacturing, sales channels, inventory, international reach, and a recognizable name. Building those elements from nothing would take time the team did not have. Warner's troubled Atari operation offered much of that infrastructure in damaged but usable form, and negotiations accelerated. In early July 1984, Tramel Technology acquired Atari's home computer and consumer video game businesses from Warner Communications. The transaction did not give Tramiel every part of the former Atari organization. Warner retained the coin-operated arcade operation, which continued separately as Atari Games. The consumer assets became the foundation of the new Atari Corporation. This was therefore not simply an executive taking over the intact company that had produced Pong and the Atari 2600. Tramiel acquired the part Warner most urgently wanted to separate from its balance sheet, along with a famous brand, existing product lines, manufacturing relationships, facilities, personnel, and a cost structure that could not continue unchanged. The new management moved quickly. Projects were reconsidered, operations reduced, and staffing cut sharply as Tramiel imposed the financial discipline associated with his years at Commodore. The consequences were severe for employees caught in the restructuring, but the arithmetic facing Atari was equally severe. The company could not carry the old organization indefinitely while waiting for a new generation of hardware. Existing 8-bit computers and game systems could still produce revenue, but they were not enough to define Atari's future. The acquisition, nevertheless, gave the former Tramel team an advantage a normal startup would have struggled to obtain. Engineers who had been planning a computer from rented offices now worked inside a company already connected to manufacturing in international markets. The Atari name remained widely recognized, and surviving operations could support the attempt to turn the pre-acquisition computer plans into a real product. Speed now became central to the strategy. Atari did not have the luxury of a conventional multi-year development cycle. A graphical computer arriving too late would enter a market already shaped by Apple's Macintosh, IBM-compatible PCs, and other systems moving toward more capable processors and interfaces. Engineering, therefore, favored technologies that could be adapted rather than invented completely from scratch. Hardware decisions had to be finalized quickly, but system software presented an equally important problem. A graphical machine required more than a processor and display circuitry. It needed an operating environment capable of managing disks, files, applications, input devices, windows, and menus. Developing every layer internally would consume time Atari could not afford. Digital research offered another route through GEM, a graphical environment already being developed for other computers. Atari engineers could adapt it to the Motorola 68000, rather than begin with an entirely new interface. Microsoft also expressed interest in supplying Windows, but its timetable did not align as closely with Atari's urgent schedule. The eventual direction toward digital research reflected the same pressure shaping the rest of the project. The company needed software that could become usable on the new hardware soon enough to support an actual launch. By the second half of 1984, the outlines of the machine were becoming clearer. The 68000 provided the processing foundation. The display would support a graphical workspace. Memory and visual capability would make the system a substantial step beyond Atari's earlier 8-bit computers. Yet much of the product still existed as prototype boards, unfinished software, and engineering decisions being made under severe deadlines. Atari was financing its own recovery while the machine was being created, which left little room for leisurely refinement. A technically impressive computer that remained unfinished for another 2 years could not restore dealer confidence or generate the revenue the reorganized company needed. Then another complication began to move toward Atari from outside its laboratories. Before Tramiel took control, Warner-era Atari had entered an agreement with a small technology company developing an unusually ambitious Motorola 68000-based system. The arrangement involved financing and potential rights connected with custom semiconductor technology that Atari believed could matter to future products. The company on the other side of that agreement was Amiga. By the time Atari's new team was accelerating work on its own computer, Amiga was running short of money and searching for a way to secure its future. What happened to that technology would soon connect Tramiel's rebuilt Atari directly to the company he had left only months earlier. Amiga's need for money made its unfinished computer project vulnerable at exactly the moment its technology was becoming more valuable. Long before Jack Tramiel controlled Atari, the Warner-owned company had entered an arrangement with Amiga that provided financing tied to future rights, involving the custom chips being developed for the Lorraine system. Jay Miner and the engineering team were attempting something far more ambitious than another conventional home computer. A Motorola 68000 would provide the central processing power, but much of the machine's distinctive capability would come from specialized hardware designed to handle graphics, sound, memory movement, and other demanding tasks without forcing the processor to perform everything itself. The architecture promised unusually fluid animation, rich color, sophisticated audio, and multimedia capabilities difficult to obtain from ordinary personal computers of the period. Technical ambition did not solve Amiga's financial problem. Custom chips were expensive to develop, Prototypes had to become manufacturable hardware, and the company needed additional capital before its engineering could become a commercial product. Atari's earlier financing had provided temporary relief, but that agreement had been negotiated before Tramiel acquired Atari's consumer operation. The distinction would soon matter because the people now rebuilding Atari had not created the arrangement, even though its consequences were about to become part of their future. During the summer of 1984, Commodore emerged as a company capable of giving Amiga a more permanent financial home. The timing created an extraordinary corporate reversal. Only months after Tramiel had left Commodore and begun assembling a new computer organization, his former company was moving toward ownership of one of the most advanced personal computer projects then under development. Commodore acquired Amiga in 1984, gaining not merely a prototype but an experienced engineering group and a custom chip architecture that could carry the company beyond the 8-bit generation represented by the Commodore 64. For Commodore, the acquisition offered a technological path that would have been difficult to reproduce quickly inside its existing product line. For the new Atari, it immediately raised questions about rights inherited from the previous Atari organization. Atari argued that the earlier agreement with Amiga gave it claims connected with the developing chip technology and brought legal action over those rights. At that stage, however, there was no final judicial answer that transformed either side's position into a simple historical verdict. The important point was uncertainty. Technology that Atari's former owners had helped finance was now controlled by Commodore, while the reorganized Atari was attempting to create a different next-generation computer of its own. Reducing the dispute to the claim that Commodore had simply stolen Atari's future would obscure the contractual complexity and exaggerate what had been established. Another legal conflict was developing closer to Tramiel's engineering team. Several former Commodore employees had joined his new organization, including Shiraz Shivji. Commodore alleged that former employees possessed confidential company material and pursued legal action concerning trade secrets. For Atari, the immediate problem was not whether later courts would eventually accept every allegation. It was that engineers working under an already severe development schedule were now operating amid litigation involving their former employer. The company could not allow that uncertainty to become the center of the new computer program. Atari still needed a product, and the schedule continued to tighten. Shivji's team had already established much of the basic direction before the Atari acquisition, but turning that plan into a manufacturable computer required a series of decisions that could no longer remain theoretical. Processor choice had to be settled. Memory, display circuitry, storage, input devices, expansion, and the physical layout of the machine all had to become concrete. The team ultimately selected Motorola's 68000 after considering alternatives, including processors from National Semiconductor. The choice provided substantial capability while avoiding the need to create an exotic CPU architecture internally. That mattered because Atari's greatest shortage was not ideas, it was time. Engineering effort had to be concentrated on the parts of the machine that could distinguish the finished system rather than rebuilding technologies that could be obtained elsewhere. System software created the same pressure. A graphical computer needed windows, menus, disk management, file handling, input support, application services, and a stable relationship between what appeared on the screen and what the hardware could actually perform. Developing every layer from the beginning would have consumed a schedule Atari could not afford. Digital research offered another path through GEM, a graphical environment already being developed for other computers. Atari engineers therefore worked to move GEM onto the 68000-based system and adapt it. The low-level software needed to make it function on the new hardware. This was not a simple installation. Components had been designed around different assumptions, code continued to evolve, and Atari's software work had to progress while the underlying graphical environment was still changing. The pressure encouraged a broader philosophy throughout the ST project, where a usable component, software layer, or established technology could satisfy the design. Atari had little incentive to spend precious months reinventing it. The company needed a modern system quickly enough to restore commercial momentum. That condition also helps explain why the ST developed along a different engineering path from the Amiga. Commodore's newly acquired platform relied heavily on specialized custom chips to deliver distinctive graphics and audio capabilities. Atari did not attempt to duplicate that exact architecture. Its team pursued a comparatively direct design that could reach production rapidly and still deliver a substantial advance over the company's older 8-bit machines. The difference was not simply one of engineering taste. It emerged from the commercial circumstances surrounding the project. Atari had inherited a damaged consumer operation, was cutting costs, and needed revenue from new hardware before the rebuilding effort exhausted its available resources. A technically elegant machine that remained unfinished for several years would solve none of those problems. Tramiel's pricing instincts reinforced the deadline. Apple's Macintosh had demonstrated the appeal of a mouse-driven graphical computer, but its cost left room for another company to offer 68000-based graphical computing at a much lower entry point. Atari intended to occupy that space. The ST therefore needed enough memory, processing power, display capability, and software to look like a genuine generational step without acquiring the cost structure of a premium workstation. Every additional feature had to be weighed against both manufacturing expense and delay. By late 1984, hardware and software that had existed only as plans months earlier were beginning to converge. Prototype boards became functioning systems. The graphical environment took shape. Industrial design moved toward cases that could be shown publicly rather than laboratory assemblies hidden beneath cables. Engineers worked through an intense schedule as the January 1985 Consumer Electronics Show approached. The objective was not to create the illusion of a finished machine. Atari needed working computers capable of proving that its new direction existed in hardware. When the ST systems appeared at CES, development was still incomplete, but the demonstrations were credible enough to change how the company could be viewed. Only months earlier, Atari's consumer business had been associated with enormous losses and uncertainty. Now the company could show a Motorola 68,000-based graphical computer with substantial memory, a mouse-driven interface, and an aggressive pricing strategy, aimed at buyers who wanted more capability than the 8-bit generation could provide. The speed of that transformation was itself commercially important. Dealers, developers, journalists, and potential customers no longer had to judge Tramel's Atari entirely on promises. There was a machine in front of them, yet reaching the trade show floor was only one threshold. Software still had to mature, manufacturing had to scale, distribution had to work, and buyers would eventually compare the ST not with Atari's troubled past, but with other computers they could actually purchase. Commodore was moving toward that comparison from the opposite direction. Through Amiga, it now possessed a platform whose custom architecture offered graphics and sound capabilities that differed sharply from Atari's more rapidly assembled design. The two companies were no longer linked mainly by Tramel's departure or by disputes inherited from 1984. Their engineering decisions were becoming products. Once those products reached the market, price, software, developers, distribution, and the usefulness customers discovered in each machine would matter more than the corporate history that had brought them there. By the time customers could judge the machines for themselves, Atari and Commodore were no longer competing through unfinished prototypes, legal claims, or promises about what their technology might eventually become. The Atari 520 ST began reaching buyers in 1985 as a real product, built around the strategy Tramel's team had pursued since the previous spring. Modern graphical computing at a price low enough to challenge assumptions about what a 68,000-based machine should cost. With 512 kilobytes of memory, a mouse-driven GEM desktop, bitmap graphics, and a collection of built-in connections, the ST offered a visible break from Atari's 8-bit past. Its appeal did not depend on one spectacular technical feature. The combination mattered. Buyers could obtain a system that looked and behaved like part of a newer generation without entering the price range associated with Apple's Macintosh. For Atari, that was the commercial point. The company did not need to prove that every element of the ST was more advanced than every competitor. It needed enough capability, at the right price, to convince people that Atari had returned to serious personal computing. Commodore entered the same period with a machine developed through a very different history. The Amiga 1000 was formally introduced in New York in July 1985, carrying the technology Commodore had acquired from Amiga the previous year. Its Motorola 68000 processor was surrounded by specialized hardware designed to handle graphics, sound, and memory operations, with an efficiency that made demonstrations immediately distinctive. Animation moved smoothly. Color and audio could be used in ways that were difficult or expensive on many contemporary systems. The operating environment supported multitasking, and the machine could present graphical computing as something more dynamic than the static office-oriented image many users still associated with personal computers. Yet technical spectacle created its own commercial challenge. The original Amiga 1000 entered at a higher price than Atari's ST configurations, and required Commodore to persuade customers that the extra cost represented access to a platform worth adopting. That depended on much more than demonstrations. Software had to appear. Dealers had to understand the machine. Developers needed confidence that the installed base would grow. Commodore also had to decide what kind of computer it wanted the Amiga to be. Its capabilities made it suitable for games, graphics, creative work, video, and serious applications. But presenting that flexibility clearly to the market was more difficult than showing an audience an impressive animation. Atari faced a different version of the same problem. Price could reduce the barrier to buying an ST, but it could not create an application library by itself. A graphical desktop meant little if the programs people needed never arrived. Atari therefore had to convince developers that a company recently associated with enormous losses could support a new computer family long enough for software investments to pay off. Early availability helped. By the second half of 1985, the ST was moving from trade show demonstrations into retail channels, giving Atari something more valuable than favorable attention, an installed base that developers could begin to measure, The machine's identity also started changing as users discovered purposes Atari had not needed to emphasize at launch. One of the most important came from two small connectors built into the system. The ST included MIDI ports, allowing it to communicate directly with electronic musical instruments without requiring owners to purchase a separate interface. MIDI carried performance instructions rather than recorded sound, making it possible for software to control synthesizers, record sequences, edit musical events, and coordinate electronic instruments. On another computer, similar work was possible with additional hardware. On the ST, the connection was already there. That consistency mattered to software developers. Sequencers, patch editors, notation tools, and studio utilities began accumulating around the platform. Musicians, especially in Europe, adopted the machine in numbers large enough that the ST gradually developed a professional identity Atari could never have created through advertising alone. A design decision made during the rushed planning of the computer had found a community with a practical reason to stay. Amiga's hardware encouraged different forms of specialization. Its graphics and audio capabilities made it especially attractive to game developers, digital artists, animators, and users experimenting with multimedia. The custom chip architecture allowed software to produce results that gave the machine a recognizable character, and later hardware would extend that reputation into video production. These strengths did not confine Amiga to entertainment, just as MIDI did not turn the ST into nothing more than a music workstation. Both machines crossed home and professional boundaries. What changed was the kind of software and user communities that gathered around them. Those communities began giving each platform value that no specification sheet could fully describe. A musician who accumulated sequencing software and studio files had reasons to remain with the ST. An artist or video user who built a workflow around Amiga applications became invested in that environment. Games, utilities, development tools, peripherals, magazines, user groups, and specialist dealers added layers around the original hardware. The machines were becoming platforms rather than isolated products. That development made the rivalry more complicated than the simple question of which computer was faster or cheaper. Atari could lower prices and introduce new ST models, but it also had to protect the confidence of the people writing software for them. Commodore could exploit Amiga's unusual hardware, yet every new technical capability still required applications capable of turning it into something customers valued. Distribution mattered differently from engineering. A machine unavailable in the right stores could lose sales regardless of performance. Marketing could attract first-time buyers, but poor support could make developers cautious. A successful niche could strengthen a platform without necessarily translating into dominance elsewhere. Geography added another layer. Atari ST and Amiga gained particularly strong followings in parts of Europe, where their pricing, gaming markets, and home computer culture created opportunities different from those in the United States. In North America, IBM-compatible PCs were becoming increasingly common in businesses and homes, while Macintosh maintained its own graphical ecosystem. The same software company now faced more potential platforms than it could necessarily support with equal attention. Every port required programmers, testing, updates, customer support, and distribution. Choosing one system increasingly meant postponing work on another. That pressure did not immediately weaken Atari or Commodore. The ST continued gaining users, and Commodore expanded the Amiga family beyond the expensive original model. What it did change was the meaning of a successful computer launch. Getting hardware into stores was only the beginning. Atari's spectacularly fast development schedule had solved the problem that confronted Tramiel in 1984. The company needed a credible new machine before its financial opportunity disappeared. Commodore's Amiga acquisition had solved a different problem by giving the company an advanced architecture capable of carrying it beyond the Commodore 64 generation. Neither solution guaranteed what happened afterward. By the later 1980s, the strongest parts of both platforms were increasingly visible. The ST had become associated with accessible graphical computing and a serious music community. Amiga was building a reputation around games, graphics, sound, animation, and creative production. Each company had succeeded in creating reasons for customers to care about its machines. Yet the market surrounding those successes was beginning to demand more than either a low price or unusually capable hardware. Developers were watching installed bases. Buyers were accumulating software they did not want to abandon. Businesses were becoming accustomed to compatibility across machines from different manufacturers. Retailers had to decide which platforms deserved shelf space. Atari and Commodore were still competing with each other, but the next stage of their history would be determined increasingly by forces that neither company could control simply by releasing a better computer. Atari's recovery became measurable before the decade was over. The company that Tramiel had taken over amid enormous losses returned to profitability, expanded the ST family, and developed particularly strong markets in Europe. That achievement mattered because the original task had never been merely to produce an impressive prototype. Atari had needed a commercially viable computer business, and the ST gave it one. The 1040 ST extended the strategy with more memory at a price that continued to challenge expectations about what a capable graphical machine should cost. The 1040 ST extended the strategy with more memory at a price that continued to challenge expectations about what a capable graphical machine should cost. Musicians, developers, home users, and small professional operations gave the platform reasons to remain relevant beyond its launch moment. Atari had survived the immediate crisis it inherited from Warner. Survival, however, exposed a more difficult question. How long could the company keep renewing the platform as the surrounding computer market became larger, faster, and increasingly difficult for an independent architecture to resist? The answer would not emerge from one disastrous product or one decisive competitive defeat. Faster and increasingly difficult for an independent architecture to resist? The answer would not emerge from one disastrous product or one decisive competitive defeat. Pressure accumulated through a series of choices. New ST models had to justify themselves to people who already owned software and peripherals. Developers had to decide whether future Atari sales warranted continued investment. Retailers weighed Atari machines against products from companies participating in the expanding IBM-compatible market. In the United States, Atari never regained the kind of broad computer presence its name had once possessed, even while the ST established stronger positions elsewhere. Europe became especially important, helping sustain the platform through customers whose experience of the computer industry differed from the increasingly PC-centered American market. That regional strength gave Atari time, but it could not remove the underlying burden of carrying its own architecture forward. The company also made decisions outside the ST business that consumed money and management attention. Its acquisition of the Federated Group electronics retail chain proved costly and added another complication to an organization still trying to maintain momentum in computers. More advanced machines followed. The Atari TT pushed the architecture toward higher-end computing, and the Falcon later attempted to extend the family with stronger multimedia capabilities. Each new system demonstrated that Atari still possessed engineering ambition. What became harder was creating the commercial scale needed to turn those machines into another transformation comparable to the original ST. The conditions had changed. In 1985, Atari could attract attention by offering a surprisingly capable graphical computer at an aggressive price. Several years later, buyers were not evaluating hardware in isolation. They were bringing existing software collections, established workflows, peripheral investments, and expectations about what the next computer should continue to run. A new Atari system, therefore, had to compete not only with another machine on a store shelf, but with the accumulated value of everything surrounding that machine. Commodore encountered its own version of the problem. The Amiga family expanded beyond the original 1000 and reached a wider audience through models such as the Amiga 500, while more expandable systems strengthened the platform's presence in creative and professional environments. The technology continued to attract devoted users, and its identity remained unusually distinct. Yet the strength of the machine could not insulate Commodore from instability in the company responsible for sustaining it. Management changes, uneven product strategy, financial pressure, and increasingly intense competition accumulated over years. The Amiga did not disappear because its graphics suddenly became inadequate or because another computer defeated it in a single confrontation. Its future depended on Commodore's ability to keep converting engineering capability into products, marketing, distribution, development tools, and enough confidence for software companies to remain committed. By the early 1990s, that task was becoming harder. Commodore entered bankruptcy proceedings in 1994, ending the corporate structure that had carried the Amiga through most of its commercial life. That outcome does not turn the computer itself into a failure, and it does not make Tramel's departure a hidden cause waiting 10 years to reveal itself. Too many decisions, executives, products, competitors, and market changes intervened for such a simple explanation to hold. Atari followed a different trajectory. Its computer business gradually lost the ability to command the broader market. Even though the company continued pursuing new hardware and remained active in electronic entertainment, the ST family never experienced one clean moment when the market collectively rejected it. The ST family never experienced one clean moment when the market collectively rejected it. Its position narrowed as maintaining an independent computer platform required resources Atari increasingly struggled to justify. Software support became less certain. Successor machines faced a smaller potential audience. Price advantages became less extraordinary as compatible PCs spread across manufacturers and moved downward in cost. The company that had once returned to the market through extraordinary development speed could not repeat that same rescue indefinitely. This is where the rivalry between Atari and Commodore becomes more revealing than the personal story that initially connected them. Tramel's return created a striking historical reversal, but neither company ultimately controlled the environment in which the contest unfolded. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, IBM-compatible computing had become less dependent on IBM itself. Manufacturers could build compatible systems at different prices and performance levels while participating in a broadly shared software market. Customers could replace one compatible computer with another without necessarily abandoning every application they had learned or every file they had created. That continuity accumulated value over time. Atari and Commodore could offer features that individual PC models lacked, sometimes dramatically so, but each remained more responsible for carrying the future of its own platform. A weak product cycle could therefore damage more than one generation of hardware. It could weaken developer confidence in everything expected to follow. The historical significance of that change is easy to miss if the story is reduced to a contest between ST and Amiga specifications. During the earlier home computer era, a company could alter the market rapidly through an attractive machine and aggressive pricing. Tramiel had demonstrated that at Commodore and then applied a related discipline when rebuilding Atari. By the next decade, those skills remained valuable but were no longer sufficient on their own. The accumulated weight of software compatibility, distribution, and long-term platform confidence could outlast advantages visible in the hardware of any single year. That does not mean the technically best computer was destined to lose, because there was never one objective measure of best capable of deciding the market. It means the unit of competition had grown larger than the computer itself. A buyer increasingly chose not only a processor, graphics system, case, keyboard, or price. The purchase connected that buyer to applications, peripherals, developers, future upgrades, and expectations about what would still be supported years later. Atari and Commodore both created machines capable of inspiring unusually durable loyalty. Their communities survived long after the commercial power of the companies weakened, which is evidence of how much value those platforms actually created. The decline of their mainstream position, therefore, should not erase what Tramiel accomplished after 1984. He had taken control of Atari's damaged consumer operation when its previous owner was trying to escape severe losses. Within a remarkably short period, a new engineering organization produced the ST and returned Atari to credible competition in personal computers. The company became profitable again and established a platform with a life far beyond the emergency in which it had been conceived. Commodore, without Tramiel, found its own next-generation path through Amiga and produced a computer family whose technical and creative reputation would endure long after Commodore itself disappeared. Neither result fits neatly into a story where one side defeats the other. The more consequential outcome was that both companies proved capable of building distinctive alternatives, just as the economics of personal computing were making such independence progressively harder to sustain. Jack Tramiel had once helped turn Commodore into a mass-market computer company by insisting that advanced technology could be pushed toward ordinary buyers. After leaving it, he applied the same instinct to Atari and built a competitor strong enough to confront his former company in the next generation of computing. That was the remarkable achievement. The limitation became visible only afterward. Hardware could create an opportunity, and aggressive pricing could accelerate adoption, but neither could guarantee the future of a platform once millions of users and developers had begun investing in larger systems of compatibility. Tramiel succeeded in bringing Atari back into the fight. What neither Atari nor Commodore could command was the market that the fight itself was becoming.